All right. This is your Gaza War Sit Rep, day 138, with absolutely no end in sight. Starvation is beginning to happen. We've had many deaths from starvation in the north. Um, and let's begin with the reports from the fronts. I figure since we are now in the starvation phase, we should report on um, Israel's continuing Israel and the United States continuing moral collapse, as that is the story of starvation. We have another demonstration here. Um, Parents, children, people of different political persuasions all gathering together to block humanitarian aid into the starving Gaza Strip. So that's Israel at the border to Gaza. We have another great specimen here. We have a congressman from Tennessee. You've probably heard by now of Congressman from Tennessee. He's being sort of accosted by a protester who says, we're killing children. And the congressman looks at her and says, you know what? I think we should kill them all. How about that? Um, so that's where America is at. That's a perfectly normal American politician doing normal American political type things. And then we have a Minister of Social Equality and Women's Advancement, May Golan, in the Israeli Knesset. They're all gathered together to announce that they will oppose a Palestinian state. There's a surprise. Apparently, there's some kind of some of them are arguing that they oppose a Palestinian state because they want to support a Palestinian state later, so they have to refuse it now or something. But this person is saying, I am personally proud of the ruins of Gaza, and that every baby, even 80 years from now, will tell their grandchildren what the Jews did. So throwing a little anti-Jewish sentiment in there, which of course is characteristic of the pro-Israel people. We have another member in the same session of the Knesset, who Hanoch Milbitsky, talking to one of the Arab members of the Israeli parliament. He says, you will die, your children will die, your grandchildren will die. There won't be a Palestinian state, and there never will be. So that's where we're at. This is the government and their regime and the ideology that all Western progressive politicians are supporting, whether you're talking about Justin Trudeau or Jagmeet Singh or Olivia Chow, any of the Canadians whose names I know. Of course, there are many across all of the countries west of the West, France, England, Germany, you name it. I'm sure we can find examples of these people with very wonderful forward-thinking values that support this kind of behavior and language and rhetoric and profit off of it while trying to sound good and smell like roses. So I think that's what things are looking like in Western society as we advance deeper into starvation driven deaths. Maybe you've seen the projections from a report by Johns Hopkins University faculty. Let me just pull that up. They've projected that, and I mean, the thing is, yeah, these are the numbers that they put forward in this report. I'll just show you. Yeah, it's a Hopkins Humanitarian Health. I'll just show you the website in case you want to go there. And they've got Gaza projections. I guess the website is now gazaprojections.org, and they've made projections, status quo and escalation numbers, total including epidemics. So we're, escalation or status quo, we're looking at upper range of their predictions by the end of August to be 200 to 250,000 dead from this war. and they show their methodology for doing that, public health methodology. I mean, it's, this would, I would think this would shock and horrify people, and it does if you are a normal person with a conscience, but of course that's not who we're talking about, and that does not describe our political class whatsoever. So in fact, I would think the people that I showed you in the Israeli Knesset would see these numbers and view them with quite a bit of pleasure. So that's the world we live in. Now, there's a couple of other things I want to do after I report from the headlines. And I want to talk about Syria specifically, a lot of different dimensions of Syria. The same way I talked about Egypt a couple of sit reps ago, I want to talk about Syria today for a number of reasons, not least of which because Israel bombed Syria, I think today or yesterday. So let me just talk about Iraq, the Iraq front, the Iraqi resistance. I have not seen activity from in recent days, so I don't have anything to report, although the absence of things to report is something. There's there, I'm sure we'll be hearing again from those fronts, but at the moment, if you look on Arya's feed, ARYJEAY, there's a lot of activity from the Palestinian resistance. There's a lot of activity from Hezbollah in Lebanon. And of course, there has been significant activity from Yemen, which is what I'll talk about next. But the Iraq resistance has not been attacking, as far as I know, has not been attacking targets in Syria or Iraq, American bases in the past few days. Not sure what's going on there, but I'm sure we will come to know, and I'm sure things will heat up again. So about Yemen, a couple of big events in Yemen. There was a British ship called the Rubimar, which was sunk in the Gulf of Aden by Ansar Allah in Yemen. This is, I think, the first British ship that was actually out and out sunk. I suppose they were trying to run the Ansar Allah blockade. Ansar Allah said nobody goes to Israel while Gaza is besieged, and I suspect they tried to defy that. You probably also know that the United States vetoed yet another ceasefire order from all of the other members of the Security Council except Britain, which abstained. And when they did that veto, the Ansar Allah apparently said, well, then our veto in the Red Sea continues as well. When I talk about Syria historically, I'm going to mention ceasefires and why they actually happened, why they were imposed on Israel in wars like 1967 and 1973, and what the difference is today. But I'll get to that in time. The other big thing that happened in Yemen, or from Yemen, I should say, is a major drone, one of the big drones. Their drones can be anything from something you can buy at a Radio Shack to this drone that was downed by Ansar Allah in Yemen, the MQ-9 Reaper drone, which is tens of millions of dollars drone, and it's a drone that fires missiles at you. So it's like a plane. It's like a plane, an Air Force plane without a pilot, basically. And that was shot down. And they were picking that. The photo I showed was of them picking that up. The Ansar Allah people picking that up out of the sea. In terms of the empire striking back again at Yemen, yes, they've been bombing Yemen intensely. Hodeidah, all the places where they have been bombing Yemen for the past 8 years, 9 years, 7 years, since 2015. They've been bombing, and Ansar Allah in Yemen has reiterated that they're not going to stop on account of that bombing. The European Union launched a mission to the Red Sea trying to break the blockade, presumably imposed by the Red Sea, and it's called Operation Aspides. Don't see why that will have any more success than the various operations, Prosperity Guardian or whatever that was announced by the US. That concludes Yemen. Okay, in since Nasrallah's speech, there have been some major on the Lebanon front. There have been major exchanges of missiles. Lebanon has Hezbollah has made some videos of missile attacks on Israeli positions, armor, and groups of soldiers in bases and positions, kind of fortified positions. And Israel has done some major bombings against civilians again. And that brings us to the analyst Amal Saad, who is always an important source on anytime something is happening with Hezbollah, it's worth checking out what Amal Saad has to say about it. She says here, Israel has been targeting Lebanese children and civilians as a matter of strategy, not collateral damage. It is compensating for its lack of military achievements with civilian casualties to cover up for its inability to push Hezbollah away from the border area. Israel's strategy is driven by its inability to provide its citizens in the north with a sense of security. It's also driven by its attempt to deter Hezbollah from retaliating in kind. But given that mounting civilian toll could also backfire and force Hezbollah to escalate, it appears that Israel is not averse to a full-blown war. So that's where we're headed on that front. I don't myself see any way this could be avoided at this point, but who knows? I have certainly been wrong before, but this is part of why I say we are already in World War III here on day 138. Speaking of, well, no, I was going to go to Syria, but I'll go to Syria last because I want to talk a lot about Syria today, not a little. So let's go to the West Bank. Major fighting in Jenin over the past few days, and this is all the factions of Jenin. Al-Qassam Jenin Brigade, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, that's Fatah's armed wing, Al-Asifa forces. They're all fighting improvised explosive devices, attacking armor, locally produced hand grenades. They are fighting. There have been Israeli bombings in Jenin. They do airstrikes in Jenin. They treat Jenin similar to Gaza in a lot of ways. It's one of the most intense sites of combat between Palestinian resistance groups, armed resistance, and the Israeli army, and has been for at least 25 years, or 24 years, let's be, to be precise. When I was in Jenin, when I went to Gaza, the same year I went to Gaza, I went to Jenin. It was 2002, and I saw area called the Zone of Total Destruction that they had destroyed in the camp, in Jenin camp. Maybe I'll show photos of that on this channel at some point. It looks very similar to what you see in Gaza right now, in the sense of completely destroyed buildings from airstrikes and bulldozers. Houses, it's people's houses where they lived, apartment buildings. Okay, I think, and then Gaza, fighting in Gaza. Israel announced that they're going to attack Rafah. After they're committing atrocities in new hospitals in Gaza, and including in Rafah. They heavily bombed Rafah yesterday, I think, today. So there's no reason, even though it's one of the most, it would be as I've said before, an even more intense version of the atrocity that we've all watched. It's very clear that nobody who supports Israel cares at all about that, and is happy to support Israel through that. So they're just going to genocide their way through it. So there's no reason to think that any human or humanitarian considerations are going to stop Israel from the point of view of Israel or any of its supporters in America, Canada, France, Germany, England, etc. So that attack on Rafah is likely coming unless it's unless the Israeli military decides not to do it. And why might they not do it? Only that they are the kind of attritional war that the resistance is trying to impose on them through the destruction of their equipment and attrition of their infantry is reaches that critical point. It doesn't seem to me that we're at that point, but which is why I think the attack is likely to happen. But we'll see. As far as the armed resistance groups, including Qassam brigades, Hamas's armed wing, they've said they'll receive the same greeting in Rafah as they did in Khan Yunis and in Gaza City, which is to say there will be resistance hitting them every step of the way. And that has been the case in Khan Yunis and in Gaza City even now. So there has been a lot of fighting in back in the north, where the starvation is most intense and where the fighting has been intense again. So there's been a lot of attacks on all of the kinds of attacks that we've been seeing all along in Gaza City for months. Sniper attacks, blowing up tanks with Yasin, with the shoulder-launched rocket launchers, the Yasin 105s, targeting soldiers inside of houses, armored troop carriers, rockets, mortars, attacking clashes with infantry clashes. So major, I'll just show you just to see what on Aria's feed, like the scroll down through Al-Qassam brigades. It's a long scroll. Al-Quds brigades, Al-Aqsa brigades, Omar al-Qasim forces, Mujahideen brigades, and it's not done. Nasser Salahuddin brigades, Martyr Ali Mustafa. Before you get to Hezbollah, there's all these operations. So extensive fighting in North Gaza and in Khan Yunis. So something the Israelis had moved back there, so the resistance has had access to them once again, and I think that's part of it. But there's probably also other strategic logics at work. Okay, so now we're ready to talk about Syria, and a couple of notes about Syria. One, there was the Israelis bombed Damascus. They bombed Damascus all the time. But there was a bombing of a civilian target in Damascus, an apartment building. They shot a Hellfire missile into the side of an apartment building, killed civilians. So usually they bomb the airport. They're trying to keep the airport out of commission. They bombed Damascus hundreds of times. And Israel and the US support all of the Syrian armed opposition to the regime. Okay, let me show you a map of Syria, because we should start actually in the present, where you have US out, Assad in. I mean, I just want to show you that like the US is in control of part of my point. What I want to show you on this map, if should I successfully obtain a map, is that the US is in control of part of Syria, and Turkey is in control of part of Syria. Yeah, okay. This'll do for now. So to show you that Syria at the moment is partitioned between Turkish control. US is occupying a swath of Syria. I don't think it's quite this big, but this is the part of Syria that's occupied by the US. And this is the part of Syria that's occupied by Turkey. And then the rest of Syria is controlled now by the Syrian government, the Syrian state. So they were trying to overthrow Syria, the ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, was trying to overthrow the Assad government. And right now it's the Islamic State has been pretty much defeated, but Turkey is in control of northwest Syria, and the US is occupying a swath of northeastern Syria. So Syria has been partitioned and it's occupied. Its wheat, its major resources, its natural resource base is under control of the US, the oil and the wheat. And the point of the oil, the control of the oil and the wheat of Syria is not that the US needs the oil and wheat. They don't need either one of those things. They are destroying it simply so that Syria does not have it. And they are, and of course, I forgot to mention that another part of Syria that's been under occupation by Israel since 1967, of course, the Golan Heights. So part of Syria has been occupied since 1967, but the rest, these other two parts, have been occupied since more like 2015, 2017, something like that. Before the Syrian civil war of 2011, which led to this Turkish and American occupation of Syria and the Islamic State episode where they controlled part of southern Syria on the Iraq border. Before this, Syria was one of, I mentioned in a previous sit rep about Egypt that Egypt had been the big, strong Arab state that was under Nasser that had the potential to stand up to Israel with all the that was the big power of the Arabs that was standing up to Israel. And then Anwar Sadat put that all to an end. And that left Syria kind of standing alone. And Syria was not a match at all. I mean, in 1967, Egypt and Syria together were not a match, especially with the way that Egypt commanded and handled its military operation, as I talked about in that sit rep. But even in 1973, Syria was when Egypt decided to back off and tell Israel that it wasn't going to attack. Israel was able to go and crush Syria's army in 1973 in the Golan Heights and repel their attack to try to get their land back. In 1973, Syria was not able to do the job by themselves. So we can start the story actually there. At the end of 1973, when Egypt or in the 70s, let's say, in the 70s, Anwar Sadat makes his peace with Israel through his beautiful, touching relationship with Henry Kissinger and his desire to be like to emulate the great success of the Shah of Iran. And that leaves Assad in Syria, Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current president of Syria. Hafez Assad he's the only one standing, really. It was Syria and Egypt. They were together fighting Israel in 1973, and Egypt leaves. Syria is pretty much alone. Syria is worried, especially about Lebanon. Israel can attack Syria through Lebanon or through Jordan. These are both possibilities that Syria is worried about. Israel is already in control of the Golan Heights, and Egypt has repudiated responsibility for the Palestinian refugees whatsoever. So there's lots of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And so Lebanon and in 1970, there's a whole thing called Black September, where the Jordanian regime repels the Palestinian armed organizations from Jordan and kind of expels them. There's a war, basically, and significant massacres, and the Palestinians are expelled. So the Lebanon becomes the focus of where the Palestinian resistance organizations are based in the 70s, and Israel begins to attack them. They're attacking Israel from Lebanon, and Israel is destroying parts of Lebanon, saying we're doing this in self-defense. It may sound familiar to you. In self-defense, they go and destroy parts of Lebanon because they say the Palestinians are attacking them from there. So here's where we get into some, again, awful and complex history. Syria invades Lebanon in 1976, and again, I can't get into all the details. This is a YouTube video. This is a sit rep, but I'll give you some of this. There are some pretty good books you can read. There's one by Patrick Seal that's not bad. It's called Assad, The Struggle for the Middle East. It's a 1990 book, so it's got all this history. The Lebanese War, there's a pretty good book by David Hurst called Beware Small States. That's a pretty well-organized little book about the Lebanon wars. So in 1976, Syria invades Lebanon basically to crush the Palestinian guerrilla forces, to suppress them. And Hafez Assad's argument is that they're doing this to deny Israel the pretext to attack Lebanon and invade and go beyond and attack Syria, which that's Syria's big worry at that time. So they go in 1976, and the intention was to kind of preempt an Israeli attack on Syria through Lebanon. And that's not, it poisons relations between Syria and the Palestinian resistance at the time, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Arafat, led by Yasser Arafat, who's another story for another sit rep probably. And it poisons relations between them. There's shooting battles between them. There's an ambush at Sidon that's a big deal, and there's a whole bunch of really bad intra-Arab politics at this time. And then Israel invades anyway. So in 1982, Israel did their big invasion, and there were big battles between Syrian forces and Israeli forces. And Syria had also had pretty bad relations with the Soviet Union for a little while after 1976, because the Soviet Union was a friend to some of the leftist forces that the Syrians were crushing in Lebanon, and they were upset that Syria had gone in and done this. So, but they patched it up because the Soviet Union wanted to kind of protect Syria from this invasion. They wanted to protect their ally a little bit from this invasion of Israel. So this is why the Soviet Union is why ceasefires actually happened. And because the Soviet Union was able to say, if this war escalates, then it will become a superpower confrontation in the Middle East. And so the United States actually had a real reason to believe, had a real incentive to actually broker a ceasefire, which they did. They brokered a ceasefire. There's some material in Patrick Seale's book about the negotiator, a guy named Philip Habib. I don't know much about Philip Habib. Maybe commenters know. But Philip Habib brokered a couple of different ceasefires in June of 1982, and he was amazed by the perfidy of the Israelis, where he brokered a ceasefire, and Ariel Sharon, the military commander of Israeli forces at the time, he kept moving his forces forward. And Philip Habib said something like, "This is one of the weirdest ceasefires. You've invented a whole new type of ceasefire where you announce that we negotiate a ceasefire, the other side ceases fire, and you keep moving forward until they shoot you, and then you say that they broke the ceasefire." Nonetheless, when the Soviet Union got involved and resupplied Syria and called Washington on the phone and said, "This is a potential war issue for us," the ceasefire shockingly held. So the negotiation was that the Palestinian Liberation Organization would leave the PLO, who Israel called terrorists and refused to negotiate with, and the United States also refused to negotiate with. And that's not Hamas, guys. That's the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So they the point is the U.S. and Israel refuse to negotiate with whoever the Palestinian leaders are. It has nothing to do with them being Hamas right now. If you know the history, you know that the point is anyone the Palestinians are led by are the people that are unacceptable to talk to. And if there are people who are shooting back when Israel's slaughtering them, then they're using violence and they have to renounce violence as well. So the PLO was the problem. They were made to leave Lebanon. So they went to Tunisia, I believe, in 1982. And after they left, again, recall our discussion from a couple of sit reps ago, or maybe it was just the last sit rep we recorded, where we were talking about Nasrallah's speech, where he talked about the price of surrender versus the price of resistance. And the Palestinian Liberation Organization had already left. They left under a negotiated settlement in June. The armed groups had left as part of the settlement. And that's when the militias, Lebanese Christian militias under the supervision of the Israeli army, who lit flares and surrounded the camps and made sure nobody could escape, went into Sabra and Shatila camps and massacred thousands of unarmed, disarmed women and children, refugees, Palestinian refugees in these camps. So that's what happens when you don't resist, right? And that's actually, before I go on, now that we're in month 5 and we're watching starvation and the numbers are 30,000 and set to climb into the hundreds of thousands with absolute callous indifference from the entire witnessing political classes of the West, and of course the delight of Israel and pro-Israel people. There's a thing we've talked about where Israel says, well, this is all your fault. Like the trope I see, like people put it in the comments sometimes before I get to block them. Well, you shouldn't have started a war if you didn't like it, right? So like the idea that a war involves necessarily the mass murder of children and the complete destruction of civilian infrastructure, the raids of hospitals, the murder of patients in their beds, impersonating medical personnel. That war doesn't necessarily entail all of those things. And while it's possible that the Palestinian resistance underestimated the depravity and the evil that Israel is, with which Israel is conducting this campaign right now. It's possible because I don't know that anybody could have anticipated this. I didn't anticipate this. I mean, I've been people like people who have been active on this file for decades have seen Israel do things like this for many decades since its inception. If you know the history, there were things like there were massacres in 1948. There were massacres, like really, really horrific massacres that Israel committed. But this was not predictable. No human being can. And I wrote a novel called Siege Breakers. You know, where I was trying to project what the war of liberation that would actually have the end the siege, and I predicted a lot of things in that book, but I did not predict this level of depravity and this amount of evil, this scale of carnage, the way they attacked hospitals, the delight in murdering children, the snuff video channels, the statements by American and Israeli politicians along these lines. I didn't see it coming. I can't. But that's one point. One point is I don't think anybody could have seen this coming who doesn't have this mentality already. You know, if you're not a genocidal person, I don't see how you could predict this. The other side of it is if they are doing this now, they were gonna do this at some point. This was always being prepared. Nobody gets up and gets so angry that they create a series of TikTok videos dancing while they blow up residential buildings or make fun of murdering and torturing people on snuff videos. That's not something people do unless they've been prepared to do it over a long period of time through their education system and their ideological formation and their politics and their political party structures and their military and their acculturation through their military. Unless they've been prepared for this for pretty systematically, it's not a spontaneous reaction. So it's not something that Hamas made them do. It's not something that October 7th made them do. There were attacks. Many countries of the world have suffered raids, military raids that killed hundreds of people, mostly police and military personnel, like October 7th, and did not respond by committing genocide. For the most part, that's not what happens. So those are just 2 points that I kind of wanted to make as an aside. One being this was not this level of evil is not something a normal person could anticipate. And two, this level of genocidality is something that is not a spontaneous reaction, but is something that was being planned and prepared and was envisioned for Gaza at the very least, but like all Palestinians and maybe Lebanese and beyond for a long time, and it was being prepared. So there's no way that the victims of this could have behaved to prevent this from happening. And like, if you believe that there is some way that they could have behaved to prevent this from happening, then you are blaming the victims of genocide for being genocided. And yeah, that's the aside. Now back to Assad, Hafez Assad, and the 80s. So after after the Palestinian resistance is expelled from uh, Lebanon, Syria and Israel have a ceasefire that's brokered because of the existence of the Soviet Union. And the rest of the 80s now are taken up. Hafez Assad spends the rest of the 80s um, fighting an Islamist Muslim Brotherhood insurgency, which is sponsored by the US. So this is the time when the government of Afghanistan, in the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, is with Soviet backing fighting the Mujahideen insurgents who are out of Pakistan trying to overthrow that government. And they ultimately, well, they do because the Soviet Union collapses. Another story for another day. But the the use of this specific type of Islamic insurgency against a secular nationalist government, that's something that happens in Syria, and it happens in Afghanistan and elsewhere. So Syria has a very severe problem with what they identify them as the Muslim Brotherhood. There's a huge battle slash massacre in Hama, where the government ultimately prevails. But that's a big part of Syria's story in the 1980s. And then at the end of the 1980s, Syria goes into, similarly to the other Soviet Union allies, they go into a very dangerous period in the 1990s because the Soviet Union collapses. So Cuba goes through that special period, right, where they have to figure out how to survive economically without the Soviet ally. Afghanistan's government falls to the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen take over in the 90s. The Russian successor to the Soviet Union agrees to let Afghanistan fall. There's a whole bunch of other things that happen as a result of the Soviet Union's collapse. The US invades Iraq. Iraq was busy fighting Iran. Syria sided with Iran. Hafez Assad sided with Iran in the Iran-Iraq War, which was also a major turning point. When Iran had a revolution in 1979, Syria took the side of the revolution. The same way that Egypt's President Sadat had admired the Shah of Iran, Hafez Assad did not admire Iran and did not like that Iran was a stooge of the United States. And so he was very happy with the Iranian Revolution and made friends with the Iranian Revolution. And that relationship actually has been steady since 1979. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, Syria, and then the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, they signed, the leader, Yasser Arafat, signed a deal with Israel to eventually become a state, which was not ever going to be a state. It was a fake deal. It was basically a kind of a neo-colonial deal that offered them a kind of a fake state that was just going to stave off, or, that was going to enable Israel to progressively gobble up the occupied territories. Oslo is another story for another sit rep, but Syria was truly alone at that point in terms of opposing Israel in the 90s. But that was the rise of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they were gradually moving towards expelling Israel from Lebanon, which they did in 2000. So that kind of takes us to the 2000s, which is the more recent history where there's the war with Lebanon and Israel, which we covered on this in these sit reps, 2006. There's been and Syria, Iran, Lebanon, they've had this military alliance, and it's somewhat replaced. The Soviet Union was once the source of Syria's armament, and now there is some diversifying of sources, but the main story of Syria in the 2000s and the 2010s is the progressive destruction of the country through the U.S. Proxy war and the civil war and proxy war of 2011. And that also gets to, people have asked like why we call ourselves tankies and why we call when we get together to talk more affectively or emotionally about how we're processing what's going on. We call it tanky group therapy. And tanky is like a historical term. I know many of you probably know this, but it was like a split in the English left in the 1950s and 60s, where English leftists who were Trotskyists who opposed the Soviet Union and opposed what they call actually existing socialism. So like Soviet Union, China, Cuba, those are all like deformed, according to Trotsky's theory, they're deformed socialists, deformed worker states or something. So they don't believe in they believe that actual socialist countries or communist countries, especially the Soviet Union, are kind of deviating from what true communism should be. And when the Soviet Union intervened against movements that were trying to be independent of the Soviet Union in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the English Trotskyist leftists called English leftists who supported the Soviet Union in those interventions, they called them tankies, because they supported, so because the Soviet Union rolled in on tanks kind of thing. I haven't studied those interventions. I imagine in my historical podcast, when I get there, I will. I look forward to reading about those when I get to that, but I'm decades away from there. If you follow that podcast, we're in 1916 right now. So there's a long time before we get to the historical origins of the word tanky and the 1956 and 1968 interventions. But the word tanky came up again after 2011, like maybe 2013 or 2015. And it was people who wanted the Assad government overthrown called people who didn't want the Assad government overthrown tankies. So when I was watching the rise of the Islamic State and Al Qaeda in Syria, the Nusra Front, and when I was watching these groups trying to overthrow the Syrian government, and I was looking at Nasrallah's speeches, Nasrallah called them takfiris, people who decide who is and who isn't Muslims. That's like a disdainful word that he called them. When I was watching this, I was horrified. I was thinking, this is not something that is supportable by an anti-war person. I was a person who opposed the war in Iraq. And I remember trying to argue with people, including pro-Palestine people at the time, who said no, the Syrian opposition is revolutionary and we've got to support them. They've got to get weapons from Washington and they've got to use them to overthrow Assad, and that's going to help everybody. It's going to be good for everybody. And I remembered hearing such arguments about Iraq too. And I said, and I would, you get into an argument with them and you say, well, why Assad? And they say, well, because he's a bloodthirsty dictator. They describe things that happened during the war. Most of the atrocities they describe are atrocities that were committed by Syrian government forces during the civil war, which is usually, and again, not at all comparable to what Israel is doing to the Palestinians right now. But destructive civil war things like what happened in Lebanon in the 70s, or in Hama in 1982, I think. I think it was 82 as well in Syria, or in the post 2011 Syrian civil war. Horrible things. But they said, he's a bloodthirsty dictator. And he has a terrible human rights record. And I would say, well, Saddam Hussein had those things. Why did you not support the US war to regime change Saddam Hussein? And they would say, basically, the nature of the Iraqi opposition was different. The Syrians really do want to overthrow Assad. I mean, I didn't find the arguments all that coherent, so I'm not able to reproduce them as well. But that's why when people who wanted the overthrow of Assad would refer to, and what I would call anti-war people, when they would refer to anti-war people, and they made fun. It was a time people may not, again, it was a weird time. People used to make fun of the phrase anti-imperialist. It was a time when that was when I relabeled all my media projects the Anti-Empire Project and stuff, because I was trying to kind of identify myself, because anti-imperialist was like a hardy har kind of a funny joke, and anti-war was this ridiculous position. It was the anti-imperialism of fools to not want Assad overthrown and replaced with the Islamic State or al-Nusra or whoever it was. So so that's why tankies is a thing. And a couple of decent sources on that are Stephen Gowans had a pretty good book called Washington's Long War on Syria. And there was a pretty good short book by a writer named Charles Glass. And I'm going to talk about Charles Glass a little bit more. And there's been a good article in Middle East Critique, great journal if you're academically inclined, by Patrick Donovan Higgins, called Gunning for Damascus, the U.S. War on the Syrian Arab Republic. And this article goes into a lot of detail about why the U.S. would want to overthrow Assad, why the U.S., all the things the U.S. did to try to overthrow Assad, how the Syrian armed groups that were trying to overthrow Assad were backed by the United States all along, and how the U.S. occupation of Syria has proceeded, destroying oil infrastructure, agricultural basis for the country, the resources that they might have. And the conclusion here, Syria as Palestine's strategic depth. This is a very interesting phrase. And this is like the reason I always saw Israel at the heart of the attempts to overthrow Assad in Syria. And it's not me, like, it's not because I'm such a special analyst. It's what Nasrallah was saying the whole time. He was saying this: if Syria falls, then all of our efforts to defend Lebanon against Israel also fail. The occupation of Arab lands is going to have a massive setback, and Syria itself is going to be divided and devastated. The minorities are going to be massacred, which is a lot of what happened when the Islamic State had taken over, and now that the U.S. is occupying huge parts of it. So Charles Glass, just to get back to Charles Glass, because Charles Glass wrote a pretty good book about Syria. And then I was looking up what he's up to, and he wrote a long article for the New York Review of Books called "Disenchantment and Devastation in Syria," and I found it a little unfair in some ways, but because of the credibility that he has from the book that I read of his, I think I wanted to check it out. So what he says is he talks about the really dire economic situation that the sanctions have, U.S. sanctions from 2019. He calls it an all-out perfunctory U.S. sanctions on Syria have been in place since 1979, but the all-out economic blockade went into effect in 2020 when Congress passed the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act. The Orwellian preamble to the fact sheet states, our sanctions under the Caesar Act are not intended to harm the Syrian people. Obviously, they are intended to harm the Syrian people. So he just talks about how the occupation of Syria, the division of Syria, the control of the resources by the U.S., and the economic disaster of the sanctions have all combined to really crush Syria since 2011, and Syria's not been able to get back on track because parts of their country are occupied, and anyone who might try to help them reconstruct is also subject to U.S. sanctions. So countries are scared to help them rebuild as well. So there hasn't been significant rebuilding. And so Syria is also starving right now. Syria is also, people are in a really, truly dire situation in Syria. And that situation also is going to have to change as part of the process of the general situation in that region getting better. What I mean to say is, like, peace in Palestine also requires, and reconstruction is also going to require Syria being able to get back on its feet. And this is also why there's so much, the challenge is so immense that for Ansar Allah in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the devastated Syrian regime, the sanctioned Iranian government, all to try to manage by themselves against the great power of the world, the US and Israel, and so many of these Arab countries that have long since defected to the US side, especially Egypt, as I've mentioned before. So it's just such a difficult situation, and the role of Russia in all of this has been just, I would say, like, almost barely helpful. So it's this, Russia stopped when the Islamic State, which was sponsored by the US and Turkey and the Gulf states, was on the verge of taking over Syria. Hezbollah intervened. Iranian support also came, and they intervened to fight the Islamic State in Syria, and were fighting, and they were starting to lose because the US continuously invested more and more. And then when they were starting to lose and Syria was about to fall, Russia intervened directly as well. And Russia basically contributed to the destruction of the Islamic State in Syria. And Russia continues to kind of have a role. The Russian Air Force continues to play a role in Syria, but they pointedly do not defend Syria from Israel. They have a separate deal with Israel to allow Israel to do whatever they want to Syria. So, and so Syria, it is has got this has taken this stance, and like I said, a very complicated history since the 70s, as I've tried to present, that it has paid so much for, especially in recent decades. And Syria is continuing to carry, or not, I don't know, carry, but like carry, I guess, a part of the resistance burden, and suffer greatly as a result of it, of not making the kind of deal with Israel that Egypt did. And I guess, Egypt is suffering from making the deal. So this is also takes us back to the price of resistance versus the price of surrender. Ultimately, it's the price of being in the target sites of the empire that leads to all of this human suffering, not necessarily something you do or a decision you make as a targeted country. So that's what I wanted to say about Syria for now. I wanted to just kind of explain where they are in the region and why, what my take on Syria, which I know is a controversial take, because I know that there are a lot of people who are pro-Palestine who believe that the Syrian regime has to go. And I don't understand that. I wouldn't advise comment trying to take me on in the comments about it. I do remove demeaning comments and uncivil ones, and also illogical ones. So I wouldn't, like I said, I wouldn't recommend, if you're of the Assad must go persuasion, let's not try to hash that out in the comments, please. I just wanted to put it out, what, for those who don't know, why where the tanky label comes from, why we've kind of taken it up as a badge of honor, and the role that Syria plays in the region to date. So I'll leave it there. I've gone on long. I hope I haven't repeated myself too much. I don't think I have. And we'll probably be back with John Elmer tomorrow-ish, to talk about some other aspects of day 139. All right, like and subscribe, please, and we'll see you soon.